For coming to the evening session of this talk. My name's Dan Pietersen, and this is my third appearance in Romancing the Gothic. I've done a previous talk. I ran a microfiction workshop for one of the Days of Creation, and now I'm doing this talk about Robert Murray Gilchrist, an author from the late 1800s, and my thoughts on his stories and how he fits into what I've called the Gothic weird. So it takes in Gothic elements, but also talks about the beginning and the development of what will become weird fiction, a slightly different but very much related genre of fiction. My contact details are down there and the hashtag, and I'll put that up again at the end. So if you do want to talk to me later on about it, then feel free to get in touch. As a kind of introduction, before the introduction, I'm just going to go through what I'm going to talk about in this hour of talk. To start with, I'm going to talk about who R Murray Gilchrist was. His name is Robert Murray Gilchrist, but he writes under the name R Murray Gilchrist, possibly to distinguish himself from his dad, who had the same name. I'll go through some of the biography that we know of Gilchrist, which is sparse, but some ideas then, why I think his work is interesting. I'll place him into the timeline of weird and Gothic fiction, and see what it is about Gilchrist's work that I think is worth looking at and hopefully bringing back into the public eye. At the end, I will have a deeper look, as Sam said, at two of Gilchrist's stories, one more Gothic, but with a bit of a weird twist, one more weird, but with some Gothic elements. At the start, I'd like to say there's a couple of mild, I think, content warnings. It doesn't seem right to say that suicide is a mild content warning, but there is a brief mention of the suicide of a fictional character. That's one slide in the presentation, and I will tell people when that's coming up. There is also near the end some nudity, but that is, again, it's paintings and illustrations. And based on discussions that we had in the Sam's talk on Sublime yesterday, I've put a content warning there for philosophy, for anybody who may have issues with philosophy, which is, as someone who's done a philosophy degree, I understand that completely. Inevitably, there will also be some spoilers for Gilchrist's stories, but I think, although that might be slightly disappointing for people coming to this new, which is probably most people in the talk, I think the experience of reading his stories is maybe more interesting sometimes than the plots. The plots are good, but they are very small. Many of Gilchrist's stories I'm going to be talking about are only a few pages long. So I hope the idea is we'll give you more depth to these stories at the expense, possibly, of spoiling some of the surprise. So who was R Murray Gilchrist? We have a picture of him there. And when I do talks about Gilchrist, I've done a few lectures and some other sessions about him. I'm often asked why I use such a photograph where he looks so nervous and awkward. And the response to that is this is his official author photograph that was placed in a number of his books. This is Gilchrist looking at his best, I would assume, and he always does look, in the few photos that we've got, quite an anxious, awkward character. But he seems to have been very well liked and very well respected. That quote there from Hugh Walpole, who is a descendant of Horace Walpole, who wrote The Castle of Otranto, tells us that he wrote like a fine woman of the 18th century, disguised in Derbyshire country clothes. He looked like a huge red-faced English squire with a thin voice and the ambling gait of a good-natured sheepdog. He liked candles, an Elizabethan thickness of atmosphere, and if possible, the rain beating on the leaded panes. And I think, who here doesn't like that? He sounds to me someone who would be a pleasant person to be around. But there is, I think, a slight kind of duality of his nature, which we'll come into later on. But ultimately, he seems to have been, as I say, well respected, a large, kind of, not boisterous figure, but maybe a well-built figure who is well liked by his friends. And when we come to his death in the early part of the 1900s, again, we seem to get across this idea of him being someone well respected in the community. There's an obituary there from the Derbyshire Courier of the time, and that says that the church was filled by villagers and intimates alike, among them the Belgian refugees who'd come across during World War I, who were billeted nearby, to whom Mr. Gilchrist had shown great kindness. In the churchyard, the spring sunshine struggled with wintry blasts for the mastery of nature, as mourners paid heartfelt tribute to a man who was true gentleness personified. I like that quote in the middle about the spring sunshine struggling with wintry blasts. It's a very kind of Gothic, evocative statement. But again, I think it brings up, hopefully what I will talk about later on, this kind of a duality within Gilchrist's personality and some of the things he himself may have struggled with. But there's a quote there at the bottom from the semi-official obituary in the Times Literary Supplement. So he was a man of stature who would have got into that level of publication by the writer Eden Philpotts. And Philpotts said that Gilchrist was an artist too little known and valued by his own generation. So not even do we not really know about him today. In his own time, he kind of had slipped away and had become not necessarily forgotten, but maybe not attended to as much as many of his friends thought he should have been. And we can see there on the right-hand side of the screen, this is Gilchrist's grave in the graveyard of St Swithin's Church in Holmesfield, in Derbyshire. And he shares that with his sister. And the grave that you can just sort of see to the right of that one is the grave of his mother and his father. But you may be able to notice amongst the writing that there is absolutely no note whatsoever of Gilchrist being a writer. And that's strange because beyond these kind of biographical fragments, the one thing that we do know about Gilchrist is that he was a prodigious author. He wrote 22 novels. There's one of them there, Beggar's Manor, with its beautiful kind of minimalist a cover, which I imagine is slightly faded from what it would have been. Most of these, to one degree or another, can be described as a kind of Gothic romance. They have that romantic feel to them. Some of them are slightly more sinister than others, and some of them are a bit lighter. There is one, and I forget the name now, but effectively the plot of it is a female serial killer. So that's quite dark elements, but there are other ones that are slightly more lighter. However, of these 22 novels, not a single one of them is still in print. In fact, in order to get hold of one, the only one that I've been able to actually read in its physical sense is The Labyrinth, which is held in the repository reading room of the National Library here in Edinburgh. So it's not like they are easy to access. And even when you go to the reading room, you can't take the book out, say in the normal way you can't in repository libraries. So those 22 novels, which is a large amount of novels, have fallen away and are not well known. He also wrote 4 regional guidebooks of the local area in which he lived, the Peak District, the Derbyshire area, the north of England. It comes across when we read about Gilchrist as a person, he liked rambling. He liked to be out in the world, in the natural world. He would be seen stomping across hills in tweeds, probably with some kind of gnarled staff, I could imagine. And he would often be seen approaching his friends from far off distance, hallooing them from far afield. However, of these 4 regional guidebooks, none of them are in print. You can get hold of copies of them. They're slightly easy to get than the novels, but they aren't easy to get hold of. But for my purposes, I'm mostly concerned with the 6 collections of short stories that he wrote, and most concerned out of those with The Stone Dragon and Other Tragical Romances. This was published in 1894, and it was described by the publisher as a volume of stories of power so weird and original as to ensure them a ready welcome. And there's a copy of The Stone Dragon there, again, with a beautiful, elaborate cover. If you're wanting to get hold of this, that's about £2,000. So you can, if you have £2,000, get hold of these copies. They are not easy to come by. I've never seen a copy in the wild, although I have seen a photo, which is near enough for me at the moment. This, inevitably, is also out of print, as are all of his short story collections. But, thankfully, the collection of The Stone Dragon, and with some extra stories from other collections added in, has been republished twice in recent years. The Ash Tree Press did a version in 2003, which they called The Basilisk and Other Tales of Dread. And then in 2006, Wordsworth Editions, as part of their Tales of Mystery and the Supernatural series, did a collection called A Night on the Moor and Other Tales of Dread. And they both effectively have the same stories in them, which collects most of Gilchrist's Gothic and weird short fiction. However, if you've been paying attention, you can probably assume these are also out of print. And not even out of print, Wordsworth rebooted and revamped their Tales of Mystery and the Supernatural collection to include, to redo the artwork of existing ones and to bring some more authors into the series. As part of that, they dropped Gilchrist, and he wasn't included in the new version of the Tales of Mystery and the Supernatural. And I think that's a shame. It's not unusual for artists, not just writers, but artists of all kinds, to fall by the wayside, with only a few people still remembering them. It doesn't necessarily mean that their work is bad, but I think specifically with Gilchrist, it's a shame for a number of reasons. In order to explain why that is, or why I think that is, I want to put Gilchrist into a timeline of other work, and we may be able to build something out from that. So this is effectively the other photograph of Gilchrist. He maybe looks slightly less awkward, but only slightly. And Gilchrist was born in 1867 in the city of Sheffield in the north of England. He was born in January, and later in that same year, in May, Queen Victoria came to visit the city, a very industrial city for those of people who may not know England very well. And there was a very large amount of pomp, as you would expect when the Queen visits such a place, at the kind of element of her reign. After that, some years, although not many years, he wasn't old when he died, in 1917. He died in his home in Cartledge Hall, which is just outside Sheffield. He didn't really travel very far in his life. He didn't move around too much. And this print here is an engraving from 1950 by an artist called Sidney R. Jones. But Cartledge Hall is quite a big country estate that would have been in a very rural part of the town. I think now it's more on the edges of Sheffield as it's expanded out. And Hugh Walpole, who we heard from at the start of the presentation, described it as a low-beamed, kind of dark, Gothic house. Gilchrist would light it with candles, and he would walk around holding his candle, stooped low because of his great height. He would regale a small amount of close friends with stories that he'd written in the winter nights, which everybody who I've read who was there said they greatly enjoyed. So these dates here are interesting to me because they are the dates of the birth and the death of Robert Murray Gilchrist, but they have other significance. 1867 saw the death of Charles Baudelaire, and there's an illustration by Charles Baudelaire of himself. And Charles Baudelaire obviously is a great part of the Decadent movement, a very large figure within that movement. And I don't want to say that the death of Baudelaire brought about the death of decadence, but it certainly, I think, ended a cycle of that form of writing. In 1917, Lovecraft wrote The Tomb as the first of his kind of adult writing. It wasn't published properly until a number of years later, I think 1922. And you can say what you like about Lovecraft, and I always say, I encourage you to say whatever you like about Lovecraft, but The Tomb, as his first weird fiction, is undeniably an important part of weird fiction and the development of weird fiction as a genre. So you've got Gilchrist's life bracketed there, you've got the decadence, and then you've got the weird. And right in the middle of his life, not specifically the middle of his life chronologically, but certainly in the middle of when he was working as an active author, you have a book called Dracula, which was published in 1897. So there, smack in the middle, around the time that Gilchrist was writing his weirder fiction, you have this immensely important piece of Gothic literature. I then would like to say that Gilchrist is important because he exists in this kind of nexus of three interrelated but distinct genres: decadent fiction, Gothic fiction, and weird fiction. I've physically restrained myself from even using the word liminal as part of this, but I think he is a very liminal author within this. He takes from these, possibly not consciously, but he takes from all of these genres, but doesn't exist fully within any of them. He kind of lingers in the middle. I'm going to approach the decadent side of it first, and I think that I could probably do a talk, maybe not me, maybe somebody who knows more about decadent fiction could do a whole talk on Gilchrist and decadence. There is a lot in here to unpick and unpack, and there are a lot of levels. But I'm going to approach this first because I think it gives a grounding of what happens later on. And there's a piece there from the Academy of 1899, from an unknown author. The article's unsigned, and that says that there is nothing like the stone dragon in modern English fiction. But in it, you may distinctly trace the influence of Poe, and perhaps also Villiers de l'Isle-Adam and Charles Baudelaire. Indeed, if there is a man who could catch and cage the spirit of Fleur de Mal in our Saxon tongue, it is the author of The Stone Dragon. So even within Gilchrist's lifetime, critics and reviewers are picking up this kind of decadent feel to his work. But he also makes the point that there is nothing like The Stone Dragon in modern English fiction. It's influenced, but it isn't derivative of decadent work. And I think that's interesting and important because it brings up some of this kind of turmoil in Gilchrist as a person and in his writing. A lot of Gilchrist stories have this kind of intoxicated, soporific feel to them. One of the stories which we'll go on to later on is redolent with this kind of feel, but it's not a basic alcoholic intoxication. Many of Gilchrist's stories use flowers and plants and the natural world, the scents and the pollen of trees and flowers as a way of showing that characters are caught up in some kind of intoxicated feeling. And he does this quite a lot, but interestingly, one of the things that Gilchrist did when he wasn't writing stories was a contributor and a supporter of the Abstainer's Advocate. And that's a newsletter of the British temperance movement. So he was actively opposing alcohol as something that was detrimental to the character. And that kind of involvement with intoxication, and yet this kind of pulling back from intoxication in the real world, in the sort of daily mundane world, I think is explained quite well in a story called The Basilisk, which appears in The Stone Dragon and the newer versions of the book. There's a quote there that says, "Listen," she said, and she is effectively the antagonist of the story. "There is a creature called a basilisk, which turns men and women into stone. In my girlhood, I saw the basilisk. I am stone." And I've used that "I am stone" as the title of this talk because I think it kind of shows how Gilchrist has this flinging himself into his stories, but then also pulling back and building up these strange kind of barriers that he does. And I think, through interpreting some of the writings in his life, that there is a reason for this, and that is because Gilchrist almost certainly was a gay man. Many of his biographical fragments that we have very euphemistically talk about George Garfit as a male companion. But Gilchrist lived with George Garfit for a number of years. And in fact, the House of Cartledge Hall was subdivided with one wing for Gilchrist's mother and his sister, and another wing for Gilchrist and George. And his friends, many of whom themselves were gay, like Hugh Walpole, considered him a kind of country dandy figure. There's a quote there from Walpole himself, who said he had a passion for coloured pocket handkerchiefs. He generally carried 3, all of different colours. But equally, he didn't like any of the kind of London set and the cliques and what we might think of as this sort of decadent world of London as a city. He travelled to London when he had to, when he needed to go and speak to publishers or to other elements, but he far preferred the countryside of Derbyshire. And I think there's something there, again, this conflict. And we have there's a quote from the story My Friend, which I think is a very, very sad, mournful story. It talks about two friends, one of whom is a much more vivacious kind of character, who's very keen on the travelling that they're doing, although the travelling is never really explained where they're going or why. And then there's another character who's the narrator, who is a much more reserved, kind of shut off character, who is kind of not necessarily embarrassed by his friend's exuberance, but finds it hard to deal with. And there's a quote there at the end of the story that says, "At midday, he lay sleeping beside me on the moor. With my own hands, I made his bed, and with my own hands, smoothed the sheet." And there's an implication in that story, a very strong implication, that the narrator kills his friend and buries him. And that seems to be a very, can be interpreted, and I don't think it's too much of a leap to interpret it, as Gilchrist murdering and burying part of his personality, possibly his sexuality. There is hope in this. It's not a terminally gloomy story. The narrator mentions after this that possibly I will be able to see my friend again in a better time. So there's a hope towards the future when he might be able to be more like his friend, which is very much intimated in the story. And I think that's a very sad part of Gilchrist's life. It may well be that I'm wrong in interpreting it that way, but it seems that there's a lot of pointers towards that, and there's many other people who've looked into Gilchrist think the same. And there's a quote here from Lawrence Bush, who has a small essay called Robert Murray Gilchrist, Lost Among Genres and Genders. And he says that Gilchrist uses decadent motifs to make gender-contorting themes that uncover the inherent flaws, degeneracy, and spiritual weakness of the patriarchy as a ruling class. And I think that's true. I think there's a lot in this where, even though often narrators and the protagonists of the story are male, they are often seen as kind of not necessarily lazy, but they have a passivity to them. And the female characters in the story are often more active. They often become irritated with and are dismissive of the male characters. But equally, I think there's kind of a sadness in this. Gilchrist is trying to talk about what I think we would come to call gender theory, queer theory, but doesn't have the language at the time to talk about it fully. You get that kind of struggle within his stories. So that's my thoughts about some of the decadent elements of Gilchrist. I'm going to move on to now, along the timeline, to the Gothic part of his work. And we're in a series of talks and lectures about the Gothic, so I'm not going to go into that into too much detail, but just as a kind of reminder, for my purposes, I'm going to think about the Gothic as employing unusual locations, distant geography or exotic climes, or even sometimes imaginary locations. There's also clashing time frames. So you have modernity clashing with an archaic mode, and you have anachronisms, and you have dreams and memories cluttering up and mixing themselves up. You have often twisted moralities. I don't necessarily mean twisted in an evil sense. I just mean kind of twisted away from what you might think of as the mundane morality or the accepted morality. And you have in much Gothic fiction this idea of corruption and decay, the inevitability of the world's decay and of people's decay. So now I'm going to talk about a Gothic story. And as Sam mentioned, I'll put a link up later on, and there's a reading of this story that I did. This is a very short story, and it's called The Return. And The Return is narrated by a male character who kind of incongruously is called Brian, which doesn't feel like the most Gothic name, but he is identified almost constantly as the lover of Rose Pascal, who is a character in the book. The narrator has been away from his home town for many years, and he's been away diamond prospecting in order to build a fortune so that he can marry Rose and bring her into the life of luxury that he thinks she wants and warrants. When he returns home to the village of Holkton and to Bretton Hall, which is Rose's home, kind of very an analogue of Gilchrist's own home himself, he finds that the village, the villagers, and much of the infrastructure of the place have fallen into disrepair and have become decrepit and collapsed. There's an implication in this that the narrator has actually been away for much longer than he believes, and he believes he's been away for about 20 years. He explores the village and he sees some people that he knows, has known for a while, but they have become old. They don't specifically remember him. And then he moves into the hall itself and he encounters Rose's foster mother, Elizabeth. And she as well seems particularly and strangely aged. She is sat in the corner of a darkened room, clacking away with a pair of knitting needles, but there's no wool on the knitting needles. She's just going through the motions. She's muttering to herself, sort of unintelligible phrases and sounds. And the narrator, as it says there, notices that those sunken, dimmed eyes were utterly unlike the bright black orbs that had danced so mirthfully. So it's implied, although it isn't the actual fact, that Elizabeth has become this ghostly kind of figure. Her physicality is sunken and dimmed. She's going through these repetitive motions again and again and again, to no aim and without any real agency, very similar to a ghost walking the same corridors and the same rooms again and again and again. He moves on, he realizes that he's not going to get much out of Elizabeth, and she actually cowers away from his presence. But as the moon rises above the grounds of Bretton Hall, the narrator finally meets once again his love, Rose. And he describes her as having grown wan and tired. Her hair is described as eldritch and dark, but her skin is kind of glowing and pale in the moonlight. And after she and the narrator notice each other and are reacquainted, she very ominously announces that I no longer live in this house. And just to warn people, the next slide is the mention of suicide in the story because, as it turns out, Rose is long dead. Rose is the ghost, not her foster mother, and in fact, Rose has been a ghost for a long time. She killed herself the year after her lover left, so, according to him, 19 years ago. And not only that, the narrator at the end is led by her ghost to a part of the grounds where he falls asleep, as often happens in these stories, and then wakes with her disappeared, and he finds a small area of grass with a sign that simply says, "Here at 4 cross paths lieth with a stake through the bosom the body of Rose Pascal." And that in itself is a kind of inevitable Gothic story. You have decay and despair, and you have a ghost who then reveals the true nature of what has happened. But I think there's something slightly more to this story, and Gilchrist takes the Gothic element and adds something a little bit extra. When Gilchrist talks about Rose in The Return, he often uses very vampiric imagery. There's the staked burial, and it's not unusual for suicides to have been staked after burial, but it is undeniably a vampiric imagery. There is also, when she appears, he first sees her feet moving through wearing some silken shoes, and they are spattered with bloodstains. She appears at night. She appears very specifically, and Gilchrist makes it quite clear that she appears as the moon rises, which again is undeniably vampiric. But there's one subtle thing which I find very interesting, and this may be me massively overthinking it, purely because I like massively overthinking things. But at the start of the story, Gilchrist mentions, for quite a strange reason, that the narrator has a memory of Rose just before he left, and she's playing with yarrow. And yarrow is a plant, which there's an illustration of it there on the side. And you will see this in roadsides and in fields everywhere, really, around England. Long, thin stalks with this explosion of white flowers at the top. It's nice, but it's fairly unremarkable. But an interesting thing about yarrow, and it is something that comes up in the kind of local and herb lore names that the plant has, is that if the stem is broken, it exudes a kind of juice, a sap, and if that sap gets onto human skin, it makes human skin much more susceptible to sun damage, and the skin will start to blister and burn whenever it's exposed to sun. That, again, is undeniably vampiric. But Rose herself is not a vampire. There's no implication that she actually is a vampire. She is just kind of wrapped around with this vampiric imagery. And what I think is that Gilchrist uses this kind of the leeching forces of a vampire to talk about despair and to talk about grief. Despair and grief, in the same way that a vampire does, suck the vitality from people. It leaves them empty, but also full of the grief. In the same way that a vampire would take over a thrall by enforcing their will on the thrall, despair does the same. It leaves you enthralled to grief. And this, I think, is shown by the leeching, as it says there, of the vitality from her family, from her friends, and from even the local environment itself. The death of Rose, the suicide of Rose, has led to a grief which has sucked the life and the colour and the vitality from her environment. And that, I think, is quite Gothic, but I think it adds this kind of weird tinge to the story, which takes it to a slightly different level. And now I'm going to move on to the weird, which is kind of the final section. It's a bit of a longer section. And when we talk about the weird, it's probably a good idea to describe what it is. The weird is very different to the Gothic, because when we talk about the weird, we're looking at unusual locations, clashing time frames, twisted morality, corruption and decay, but it's weird. And that, I think, in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way, is very good descriptions of Gothic and the weird. The weird is very related to Gothic stories, but it has something that makes it slightly different. And this slide, it is a very text kind of heavy slide, but there's 4 quotes here that I think lead us to what it is possibly that makes the weird different from the Gothic. The first quote there is, again, H.P. Lovecraft. He says that the true weird tale has something more than secret murder, bloody bones, or a sheeted form clanking chains. Disappointingly, the something more that H.P. Lovecraft thought the weird should have was racism. And that is the undeniable fact about H.P. Lovecraft. As important as he is to the weird, and he was also an arsehole. But in this essay, I think he makes a good point. You can have murder in a weird story. You can have bloody skeletons, and you can have ghosts and spectral forms. But if you make it so that they are comprehensible, maybe if we see a murder, we might not understand why it's happened, but we can understand the concept of murder. Could even though we might not think that they are real, we could comprehend ghosts. We could comprehend vampires and creatures like that. The weird tale has to have something to it that is incomprehensible, that moves out of the things that we are used to. And Melissa Edmondson there adds, from her introduction to Women's Weird, she adds the reflection that the Old English word weird meant a fate or a destiny. In the same way that we would say that someone is doomed, you would say that someone was living under a weird. And that eventually, gradually, came to mean not just the idea of destiny itself, but the power to control destiny. And a good example of that is the weird sisters from Macbeth, the 3 witches who prophesy Macbeth's future, but by doing so, starts the cogs of that destiny working away. So you have this twin idea of a thing that is destined to happen, and that does get used in the Gothic. You often have this idea of legacy and vengeance and long processes of things being undertaken. But I think often there has to be actual agency that starts that off. In the weird, what we might talk about, if we're talking about specifically Lovecraft stories, the cosmic weird, the cosmic fiction. It is something that will happen anyway. Humans are involved in it, but they're caught up more in it like oil in a machine rather than the actual organizers of the machine. You have this weird, you have this doom that will progress no matter what. You don't have to go to the castle to meet the vampire. You don't have to go to the forest in order to meet the ghost or the monster. You are already in the castle. You are already in the forest, and these things will happen anyway. And Mark Fisher in The Weird and the Eerie, and one day I will do a talk that I don't mention the weird and the eerie, but that day is not today. He says that the weird brings to the familiar something which ordinarily lies beyond it and which cannot be reconciled. He says that the weird pierces in from another place into reality. It erupts into what we know of as the expected world. And that, again, goes back to Lovecraft's thought that it needs something more. And I think often, and justifiably, Lovecraft and his kind of ancestors in weird fiction are derided for the trope of saying, and it was so horrible I can't describe it. And I think that is overused. It's very easy to parody it. It kind of feels a bit weak now. But what Lovecraft and similar writers, I think, are saying is what Mark Fisher is saying here. When you talk about something that is weird, I cannot describe it. It's not that I won't, or I simply don't. I can't be bothered to describe it. I don't have the tools in my words, in my understanding, to describe what is meant to be experienced. And that can be kind of frustrating for readers. I know a lot of people don't like that. But when it's done well, I think it works. It gives you this kind of vertigo of miscomprehension or uncomprehension of the weird. And the final quote there is from a recent book, A Century of Weird Fiction by Jonathan Newell. And he says that the weird is a tumour of sorts growing out of the Gothic, composed of the same tissues but unfamiliar, alien, and yet not entirely so, at once part of its progenitor and curiously foreign to it. And that's interesting because you have then the Gothic and the weird interrelated, but one is formed out of the other and again erupts, if you like, in a similar way to how Mark Fisher talks about it. And a tumour is not what it grows out of, but it is related to what it grows out of. And it is something that, in many ways, is hard for us to comprehend. And I like that because it ties into another bit of theory, and this is the warning for philosophy coming up, for those of you who are not too keen on that. And this is Caroline Korsmeyer, the philosopher Caroline Korsmeyer, and her idea of the sublime and the sublate, which is in an essay called Fear and Disgust, the Sublime and the Sublate. And yesterday, Sam went into a discussion of 18th century sublimity and the sublime. So I think this quote is, hopefully if you saw that, this is enough to build on Korsmeyer's idea of what she means. So she talks about the sublime, and she kind of paraphrases it there as the experience of sublimity is likened to an elevation or expansion of spirit, free from earthly weight. And that links very closely into Anne Radcliffe's idea of the sublime as something which elevates the soul and the spirit, something which you are open to and which increases you, frees you from this earthly weight. But for Korsmeyer, you have the idea then, which is not an opposite of the sublime, but a kind of different view of the sublime as something which signals aesthetic insight into a bodily, visceral response. And to break that down slightly, sublimity and the sublime deals with ideas of rapture, and less so the religious idea of the rapture, but being enraptured by something, by being transfixed by it, unable to take your eyes off the things that you're seeing, unable to remove your senses from it. And by doing that, you become disembodied. Sublimity is often talked about as a way of not negating the body, but bringing yourself out of your concerns for your body and for the wider body of the world itself. There's enlightenment involved in the sublime, and that's enlightenment in the sense of increasing understanding and increase of knowledge of what is possible, but also enlightenment in the sense that weight is taken off you, for the moment that you're experiencing the sublime. And you have exaltation. The experience of the sublime makes you exult in that experience. The sublate, for Korsmeier, in a kind of opposite way, deals with ideas of disgust, things that are repellent to us and which we would like to recoil from. But that also involves ideas of increased understanding of our corporeality. Our body, when we think about it too much, can become quite disgusting, and it can become something that feels different from us. The sublate also encumbers us. It weighs us down with this idea. We are a thing in the world, and we are a thing in the world which will at some point no longer be a thing in the world. And that will lead us into decay and collapse. And then there's the idea of objection, which is very related to Julia Kristeva's idea of objection, the breaking down of barriers between types of things, the breaking down of membranes that keep us different from that, and which keeps the subject different from the object. And that idea, I think, is often kind of hard to distinguish, but I think we all have this idea of the sublate. And one way I think of explaining it is it's very similar to the kind of obsession some people might have of picking at a scab. We know we shouldn't do it. It is unpleasant, it's painful. It increases our knowledge of our bodiness, our embodiment, and it shows us the breaking down of our barriers between the inside of our bodies and the outside of our bodies as we bleed or as pus comes out of the wound. But crucially, for Korsmeier, the sublime and the sublate both have this magnetic attraction. She says there that you have this overwhelming effect of disgust is aversion, but it's aversion with a backward glance, lingering over and even savouring its object. So both the sublime and the sublate are something that you are attracted to, even if you might not want to be attracted to. And that comes into the story that I'm going to talk about next with Gilchrist, which is the Crimson Weaver. And in order to talk about the Crimson Weaver, I first have to talk about the Yellow Book, because the Crimson Weaver appeared in the 6th edition of the Yellow Book, and not in one of Gilchrist's short stories. The Yellow Book was, as it says there, an illustrated quarterly, which started in 1894, and it was started by Henry Harland, an American editor, and Aubrey Beardsley, an English illustrator. And Harland said that in one of the densest and soupiest and yellowest of all London's infernalist fogs, Aubrey Beardsley and I sat together the whole afternoon, and then and there we decided to have a magazine of our own. So in many ways, this is a decadent journal. There's a slide on that in a moment, but it was also a Gothic journal. It took what they thought were the staid and boring ideas and themes of the existing quarterlies and magazines, and they kind of twisted them around and they transgressed what was acceptable. Beardsley himself is a notorious figure, often in trouble with censorships, and a number of the covers of the Yellow Book were censored. That image on the cover of Volume 1, which is called Masquerade, is a small part of a bigger picture for a reason. And Stanley Weintraub, in his book, The Yellow Book, Quintessence of the 90s, he said that the colour of the Yellow Book was an appropriate reflection of the yellow 90s, a decade in which Victorianism was giving way among the fashionable to Regency attitudes and French influences. For yellow was not only the decor of the notorious and dandified pre-Victorian Regency, but also of the allegedly wicked and decadent French novel. The wicked and decadent French always appearing. Also, if you were paying attention at the start of the talk, and if you are still awake, there was another novel very famously known for being yellow, Dracula by Bram Stoker. And it's his birthday today, which is quite nice. So The Crimson Weaver is, again, a very short story by Gilchrist. It's 3 pages in the edition that I have, so it's short and it kind of rattles along. Again, it's narrated by an anonymous servant of inevitably a master, and the master is always referred to as my master, with capital M. And they are both, seeking is maybe strong, they are both heading towards the palace of the Crimson Weaver, It's never really explained why they're going there, and it's never really explained that they actually want to. They just seem to end up there. Again, this idea of weird being a doom. Whichever way they walked, I get the feeling they would end up in an encounter with the Crimson Weaver. And this palace is a palace lying in a concave pleasaunce, all treeless, but so bestarred with fainting flowers that neither blade of grass nor grain of earth was visible. And there again, you have this concentration on flowers, and bestarred indicates this kind of excess of flowers, which gives you this intoxicating feel. They come across the Crimson Weaver, and she's depicted, at least initially, as a beautiful but anguished woman. The servant tells us that she was as perfect of feature as Diana, but her skin was deathly white and her lips fretted with pain. And Diana, from the mythology, is an interesting bit of foreshadowing, because Diana famously rent apart people who offended her. And she tells us that for lack of love I perish, see my robe in tatters. And the Crimson Weaver wears this red robe, but it's a kind of shabby, faded red, and it is rent at parts. The hems are falling off, the bottom of the skirts of it are ripped and in ill repair and stained. And I like that, just as an aside, that illustration, the Penelope by Patton Wilson, is from the edition of the early book that the Crimson Weaver appears in. And Penelope famously is a weaver, but it seems that these weren't related. It's quite a nice tie-up together where there are two themes that are very similar. We then come to this encounter between the Master and the Crimson Weaver, and this is where this idea of the sublate comes into. Although she's described as a beautiful woman and one who appears to be someone who we might pity, she has this kind of weird power over the Master. And the servant tells us, my master still trembled, but he did not move, for the gaze of the woman was fixed upon him. His brows twisted and his white hair rose and stood erect as if he viewed some unspeakable horror. So something in the Crimson Weaver disgusts the Master, but he can't bring himself to tear his eyes from her. Thankfully, the servant can. The servant doesn't have this disgust, but this magnetic attraction. He's disturbed by her, but he's more disturbed by the reaction of his master. So he drags the master away and they flee from the palace of the Crimson Weaver. But they spend a night in the open air. The servant experiences these fevered dreams, which refer back to stories by Poe and people like that. And when he awakes, the servant finds that his master is no longer there. He has returned to the palace of the Crimson Weaver, and the servant follows him and finds that now, rather than flowers strewn around the palace, he finds rather strange beasts, dogs and pigs with human limbs that tear ravenously at something that lay beside the balustrade. And when the servant fends them off and scares off these creatures with human limbs, he finds that what they are tearing at has been rendered down into a pool of steaming sanguine fluid. So we have this idea, again, of slime, which is a very weird idea, slimes and oozes, and the abjection, the lack of form of these things. The weaver appears to the servant, and she's transformed as well. She had doffed her tattered robe for one new and lustrous as freshly drawn blood. And marvellous as her beauty had seemed before, its wonder now increased 100-fold. Into her eyes came such a glitter as the moon makes on the moist skin of a sleeping snake. The firmness of her lips relaxed. They grew childlike in her softness, and the atmosphere became almost tangible. I could scarce breathe. This brings in now, with the weaver enhanced in her power, the servant is feeling some of this kind of mix of disgust, the skin of a sleeping snake, but equally he is transfixed. He has become so out of his body that he lacks the ability to breathe. There's a number of readings about that. I think there's a lot of ideas of sexuality and gender elements, but for this, I think that idea of the sublate nature of this terror that he feels is very important. And we find at the end of the story the reason for this transformation And you may think that the idea of freshly drawn blood is foreshadowing, and it is. Because the Weaver, like Rose, is revealed by Gilchrist as a kind of vampire. Not the normal Dracula vampire that we might find, but one who is vampiric and who preys on humans. The servant tells us, so I followed slowly to the loom and watched her deftly passing crimson thread over crimson thread. Then she moved back and showed me the head of my master and the bleeding heart whence a crimson cord unravelled. So the Weaver isn't feeding directly on humans, on the master, but what she is doing is rendering them down into cord for her clothes. This is why her robes have been regenerated. And it's why, in relation to that, why she has been regenerated and she seems to have much more power. This, again, another element of abjection and disgust added to this kind of Gothic vampire figure, where the master is being rendered down into resource, into something that the Weaver uses to make her clothing and, like I say, make herself. And this is too much for the servant, understandably, but again, he can't flee from her. He said he crouched against the wall like a terrified dog. And we can imagine him crouching, but his eyes wide like a dog's when it's frightened, and how he's staring at her. And he doesn't flee the Crimson Weaver. He is allowed to leave by the Crimson Weaver, but only when she has taken what she wants from him. And the story ends by him fled back home, but lying half dead. And he's watching hour by hour the bloody clue ever unwinding from my heart and passing over the western hills to the palace. And the use of clue there as a word is very interesting, because one of the most famous clues, a thread, is one that was used by Theseus, entering and escaping the labyrinth of the Minotaur. And the labyrinth, as I mentioned earlier on, is another one of Gilchrist's book. But you have this now where the servant is fully aware, fully conscious and fully sentient to the fact that he is doomed. His body is slowly being unravelled by the Crimson Weaver's loom, and he will die in the same way that his master did. He is disgusted by this, as you would if you found that your body was being unravelled. He has this kind of abject feeling of his self dwindling, and he has this burden of the doom that's laid upon him. And I kind of covered that there on that slide. You have this disgust, this sense of corporeality, this encumbrance, and this abjection. And those are the elements that come out of Korsmeyer's idea of sublimity. But crucially, of the sublate. But crucially, this sublate has this aversion, so this recoiling, but with a backward glance. The master returns to his fate. The servant finds it hard to leave, and even when he has, he's still linked to the Weaver by the thread that's emanating from his body. So I hope, coming to the end of this now, this last couple of slides, that I've gone through and I've shown that Gilchrist isn't just a decadent author, nor just a Gothic author, nor just a weird author, but he blends and lives within all three of these different genres. And he takes elements when he wants to, and he uses them, but he uses these in a very interesting way, in a very blended way, which takes him out of what he would be if he was purely in one of these three camps. Hopefully that makes you a bit more interested in his writing, and hopefully you might read them and think this is completely misguided. And I would love to hear from you if you do. These are some ideas that I've been kind of developing, and I've been developing these ideas because this is the last slide. The thrust of this, I hope you gathered, is that Gilchrist's work is out of print and has been out of print for a while. But I'm currently talking to the British Library to try and get Tales of the Gilchrist collection into their Tales of the Weird series. Excellent series of books, which I like myself, and they're very well done. So I recommend them if you haven't got them. So I'm not going to post a PayPal link or a Ko-Fi link or anything like that. What I'm going to ask is if you enjoyed this, even if you didn't enjoy it, but you can pretend that you can, if you want to tweet something about how much you enjoyed it, if you happen to tag the BL_publishing handle, just to let them know, that would add to my argument. They are interested in looking at Gilchrist's work, but obviously they are a commercial endeavor and they want to make sure that it's worthwhile and will be interesting. So thank you very much for listening. That's just up to the hour. I hope you find that enjoyable and interesting. But if you have any questions, then do feel free to ask.